This week, Swing Out Sister. Now, I interviewed them some 35 years ago on Ibiza. And well, it was high time that we met again. And to be honest, this interview has already become one of my favorites because there are some very insightful and revealing answers from them for you to enjoy. So, Corinne Drewery and Andy Connell, welcome, better known, of course, as Swing Out Sister. And we will be talking about the upcoming box set, an 8 CD box set, which we released on the 27th of June. And it's titled Certain Shades of Limelight. Now, this box set contains 5 albums over the 10 years between 94 and 2004. And it's sort of on the tail of the other box set, which was the first era, in a sense, of Swing Out Sister, Blue Mood, Breakout, and beyond. I presume when you release a body of work, you're sort of going a little bit back over your life and, in a way, not only sort of revisiting the past, but taking stock of what you've achieved. So in terms of not only this one, but also the first one, how has that affected you? And has it changed your perspective in any way of what you've achieved?
Who goes first?
Difficult question. Go on.
I think we had to listen through all of our albums sort of consecutively in the running order before we did an interview with a guy called Steve Earls for the sleeve notes. And it's always a difficult one listening to what you've already recorded, because I think you tend to think, well, we've done that, we should be moving on to the next thing. And it takes about 3 years at least before you can listen to something and not notice all the things like, oh, I should have done that differently, we could have changed this bit, why didn't we include that? It takes quite a while to be able to stand back and listen objectively, if ever. But I think because we hadn't listened to these albums for quite a long time, I was going, Andy, we better listen to them, because John Earl's going to be asking us about, the work included in this box set. And I think we were both a bit gobsmacked. It's like, how on earth did we get all that stuff done, judging by the pace we go at now? And how did we do so many different things? People remember us for Breakout. People who are interested and wanted to follow our path and like the music. We've got some super fans who know all of our stuff inside out. And it's so flattering, and I kind of think, I wonder what they must have thought. And it's great that they stuck with us, because we visited lots of places, and this last box set number 2, it's the stuff that was a bit under the radar. So I think we were going to more interesting places, because it was like nobody was really watching or listening.
How do you feel about it, Andy? Was it a way of actually sort of really seeing your musical development during this period?
Well, it was when we sat down and actually we had to listen through just for quality control. And in the doing of that, that's a long, it's a long period of time in terms of a career, but it's just a physical period of time to sit and listen to music. And it was, as Corinne said, it was more emotional than I expected it to be. And the thing that struck me was, probably everyone has this, but it felt very deliberate. It felt like we knew what we were doing all the way through, which was the opposite of what was actually the case. We never, the thing while you're in the midst of it, it's chaos, and you're thinking, does this make any sense? Is it worth anything? And when you listen back, it's, wow, that's well constructed, and that leads to that, and that develops from that. And all of a sudden you could see the various arcs that were coming in and out of things, and that we, in the midst of it, we could never see, and I'm sure everybody has that experience. But it's a very odd thing, if you think music it's an evocative thing, isn't it? If you have memories, you associate them with music. It's the power of it. And I think to have that many memories suddenly descend upon you of your life at various stages in your life, it's a very, well, we've said it before, it was a very emotional thing. And I'm glad somebody put it together. We wouldn't have done it. So.
Well, when you said it's sort of evocative and it recreates memories, which music does, but when you're writing your own music, you know where you were at a particular time.
Exactly.
Which may sometimes not be necessarily the best place, and sometimes it might have been the best place. And I just wondered if that gave you a different perspective of the time back then, where you feel actually we were not, I don't mean musically, but we were okay as people there. This was okay when we may thought it wasn't okay. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, there's particularly Somewhere Deep in the Night. There were a lot that has a great melancholy. I mean, I love it. It's a beautiful melancholy, but there were a lot of things going on that were not good from emotionally and in terms of your life. Things that we had a couple of people depart and in bad circumstances, and it just, you can feel the weight. It's not a weighty. There's melancholy. It feels melancholic. And I think I do like melancholy in music anyway, and I think there's a lot of it in ours over the years. But like, as you say, yes, that you can chart certain periods when you thought, whoa, we were really struggling there. It turns out what a beautiful struggle that was. So it's, And
you, Corinne?
Yeah, the same goes for Filth and Dreams. I think that was a bit of a dark time. I think it was because we actually had heard that we had been dropped by a record company. Somebody had let some gossip out of the can, and we found out that by just some really horrible means. And so we were with Japan, and they were loyal. We still had a deal in Japan, and then Shapes and Patterns, we still had a deal in America. So we were kind of being tossed around. We felt a bit unwanted, but at the same time we could get on with stuff, not quite so much under the spotlight. So I think it led us to delve a bit deeper into uncharted territory, and some people really liked that stuff and said it was really different, and other people thought it's not as nice as the shiny stuff we did from the start. But I think it just shows the full spectrum of emotions and how we did dig a bit deeper and explore some other sounds, some other feelings. A friend of mine said, you don't need therapy, you write songs. And I think it does serve as that, and I remember when Paul McCartney's memoirs came out and he did them song by song, and they said, oh, did you keep a diary? And he said, no, you don't need to really keep a diary when you write music, because it's like Andy says, that kind of gets to some part of your brain that nothing else could. You just hear that sound, and it might be a keyboard sound, it might be a chord or a lyric, and it's like, whoa, you're back there, or it's like a strong perfume or something. It assaults your senses in a different way.
I mean, it's funny you mentioned about the sort of the melancholy of it, Andy, because yesterday a friend of mine who's in Berlin at the moment in some sort of music festival, and he met someone who's created this Melancholy-tron. Do you know this?
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. It's an amazing bit of equipment that only plays melancholic sounds.
Oh, really? Wow. I think I invented that in the 1995.
Only in Berlin as well. It's a bit like that experiment that David Bowie did with the lyrics with, who was it, with William Burroughs and Brian Eno or something, but this is a different oral thing.
Yeah, I mean, the Bowie thing was the cut-up thing, and it's really interesting because sounds do affect the body, don't they? And they're actually, I think this is a really sort of interesting area. It's like the gong thing, like sort of meditation and using the gong to create, get you in a different space. But all music seems to get you in a different space, but that's off the beaten track. I want to talk about the albums and specific tracks a little bit later, but I also want to sort of find out, and you mentioned the idea that music is therapy, and I think everything comes from the childhood. And I just wondered, maybe start with you, Andy. What music did you hear in your family home? What your parents played, and then what the change was within you, what you were then into?
Yeah, that's always a tricky one. I came from a strangely I wouldn't say an unmusical family, but music wasn't, certain people, we were always playing this, and they had Gershwin playing and so on. So it wasn't like that in my house. It was my dad had two records, I think, Louis Armstrong and Johnny Cash. Stop clicking your mic, Corinne.
Sorry, I'm not clicking it, I'm just holding my...
Johnny Cash, Boy Called Sue, and Satchmo. And he played those two, back to back. That was my experience but my mum was into, what it was? The music that I remember from childhood, and I think this is true of everybody, is going on holiday to Cornwall or somewhere in the car, and what was on the radio. So it would be Burt Bacharach, and that was the Jimmy Webb songs of the day, and all those wonderful old You know that idea that that's kind of the mix and match thing, where you'd hear Hawkwind and then you'd hear whoever, the Carpenters on Radio 1. There was no kind of format radio then, so there weren't rules as to what you might like and what you didn't like, and it was, and I do miss that. I think that's gone now. I think that those days are over.
Did music provide an escape from your...
Always. Yeah. Always. It was never something that accompanied our daily lives. It was a thing that you, as you say, escaped into. And I think we were often accused, have been often accused of being escapist. And I always took that as the highest compliment. I never understood it was supposed to be an insult. So yeah, it is very much an escape. And a holiday, that's why I associate it with holidays, I think, because, look at this, we can do anything now. And this is the soundtrack of that.
So, Corinne, I mean, for me, when I was 13, when I was very young, obviously listened to music that my mum played. When I was 13, Bowie came along. This is such the typical gay story. But as a gay teenager, I hear Bowie, and he provides a world for me where I could belong. So I just wondered what music provided for you in those terms. Was it a different world to your parents, or were your parents a sort of supportive, creative family?
My parents were quite musical, but I think that normal rebellion thing, I didn't particularly want to like the music they liked. But from very young age, my dad was in a band. He played bass only as he was a carpenter during the day and played bass in a band at night. My mum sang in a jazz band, and she was clipped poodles during the day. So, I can remember that one of the first records I really remember listening to on a stereogram was River Deep, Mountain High. And I can remember looking inside, it was probably about 3 or 4, looking inside the stereogram to see where the echo was coming from, because it just had that Phil Spector wall of sound, and I couldn't understand it. But it was also appealing to a kid, because when I was a little girl, I had a rag doll and the puppy. It was kind of like a kid's nursery rhyme, but quite dark at the same time, because there were mountains and valleys and rivers. The Rolling Stones, the Beatles are always on the radio. I remember my mum's and dad's friend coming round with the Sgt. Peppers. They had the Beach Boys, and they had, whatever was going on at the time. But then on the radio, there was Dionne Warwick and Burt Bacharach, and I'd go to my granny's and we'd listen to the Light programme. But I think, like you, I love Motown and I love Michael Jackson. I wanted to marry him because I thought he was the same age as me, but it turns out he's lying about his age, and he was a year older than me. He was on top of the pops at the age of 9. I was going, I want to do that. But then David Bowie came along and I was the same. It was like, this is where I want to be. I don't know what he is. I don't know whether I should fancy him. He makes me feel funny. Is he a girl? Is he a boy? It's kind of this strange sexuality. And my mum was listening to Bessie Smith and Mahalia Jackson and the blues, Ma Rainey, which I couldn't stand at the time. But then I read that Mark Bolan loved all that stuff. And so suddenly I knew all about Mark Bolan's favourite music. So suddenly I was dressing up in kimonos, dyeing my hair with food colouring, wearing platform boots. But also there was Slade as well, which is another, a weird curveball, because I think that was a fantastic sound. I mean, when you hear Oasis now, everyone says, oh, the Beatles. It's pure Slade, And they had their history from Jimi Hendrix, wasn't it? That Jimi Hendrix's manager managed Slade. It's a fantastic time for all kinds of different music, but yeah, a bit schizophrenic. I didn't know who I was. I loved Northern Soul after that, and used to run away to all-nighters.
But you see, Slade is another good example, though, because that is escape. That's when did you hear Slade at the Fun Fair? It went on the waltzes, and the dodgems and all the rest of it. That was the sound of escape again, really.
But it's interesting you say that, because each of the artists that you've mentioned all gave us a world which we immediately understood their world. You know what I mean? It was a sound. Yeah. Phil Spector, the sound. Bacharach, there's a particular sound. And Swing Out Sister, although there are definitely lots of different influences that have come in over the years, there is a sound that is recognizable. Do you think that is also the secret why you have lasted 40 years?
Oh, I think it's basic stubbornness as much as anything. But I do think you're right, because we always had, for want of a better word, and it's an overused word, but cinematic. We always had the idea that it should be cinematic, and that is in effect another way of saying you create your own world, And you're dead right that all those people, you want to get inside it. You want to inhabit where they are. And I think we've always, I associate that with movie soundtracks, and because that has that same thing. It's an encompassing thing that you're part of. And I'd like to think that. I mean, I certainly think when we listened through this one and the previous one, the earlier funny ones, they have, you belong in them, or you don't. And it's not something. It's not a passive thing. You have to engage in it. And I'd like to think that that's part and parcel of why we've stuck it out so long. And it's certainly it's the thing that people seem to connect with, that there is a sense of the thing. It's not just some music playing. There's an idea, there.
Do you remember the first
time? But maybe
you...
everybody says that to justify themselves.
Corinne, do you remember the first time that you got up and sang in front of people, however young we were, and what feeling that gave you?
I did sing in front of my grandma. She was always very keen to get me to play the guitar and sing Olivia Newton-John songs. But the first time I sang, I didn't tell my family. I entered a talent contest at school, so it was a bit like Pop Idol, and put a band together. We were called Triangle, and because I love Pentangle, and their theme for Take 3 Girls, Light Flight. There were only 3 of us, so we were Triangle. And I played the guitar, all 3 chords. My best friend was really pretty, so she was doing backing vocals. And the music teacher, who told me, you'll never get anywhere in music because you don't play a classical instrument. I asked his daughter if she wanted to sing backing vocals because she'd be good at harmonies. And I thought, at least we'll get somewhere. Even if everyone thinks we're rubbish, the music teacher's daughter's in that band, we're going to do it. So I was being a bit conniving. But we sang 2 songs, Morning Has Broken, the Cat Stevens song, and Day After Day by Badfinger. And I nearly fell off my chair because I was balanced on 2 steps on the stage. We came 4th.
Oh dear.
Helen, I can't remember her surname now, but a girl doing acrobatics won.
You see, that's the world you're up against, isn't it?
But we came 4th, so we still had something to strive for.
I mean, you had very different routes to Swing Out Sister in a way. Corinne, obviously you went to St Martin's. I'll start with Andy. You went through different bands, didn't you? There was the Immediates.
He's done his research. Okay.
How can you remember them?
So I just do research. The Immediates, A Certain Ratio, and at the same time Kalima. And what's interesting, particularly with Certain Ratio and Kalima, is that they really have different focuses in the type of music, and it sort of suggests that you were finding I don't really want to say your style, but you were finding where you wanted to go. Is that true?
Yes, up to a point. I see that more clearly now. I don't think we were sitting there thinking that, but we were basically, and I think this is a word that often, if you had to crystallize what was different then to now, the main word I would use is boredom. We were completely bored. There was nothing to do. We were very, we didn't have any money. We didn't have resources. What we had was a room and some instruments. So we'd all get together. It was a youth club, effectively. I don't think any of us had a burning desire to have a career. We wanted to occupy ourselves in an entertaining way, and we all loved various bits of music. So somebody would come in, and Kalima came out of a couple of guys who were very into jazz. Certain Ratio came out of a couple of guys who were very into, funky industrial. So it wasn't like, let's make this sort of a band. It was, who's in the room today? It'll be that. And I think there's an eclecticism that comes from that, because you don't embrace anything, but equally you don't dismiss anything. You can take on board various bits and pieces of everything. But I think that the finding, certainly from my point of view, the finding of myself was when the technology got to the point where I could do things, in a room full of basic equipment, you don't do an orchestral score. It's not available to you, that kind of thing. So that music is off to the side. You can't explore that yet. And I think as the technology changed, then you discover that, that's what I'm going towards now, because the technology will let me do it without having to pay £100,000 for an orchestra. So I think that technology is a big force in all of that, and also technology means now that you can see the way music's gone. It doesn't mean the same thing it used to, does it? Because there are other things that mean just as much now. Whereas before, there was only that. That was the glue. Sorry, I'm going on now.
No, but I think you're right. I think that's interesting because I think like suddenly, the iPhone has become more important than what you can hear through the iPhone.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so the actual technology has become bigger than the creative aspect of the technology. That's my view in some way.
And the music now is really to accompany you when you're driving in your car or you're doing something. Oh, I'll put some music on. It's not like I've got to drive to where the music is. It's a different thing.
No, it's a different life force, I think. Corinne, for you, how did you get to St. Martin's? Because it can't have been that easy to get in.
I think it was pure ignorance, really. I suppose I grew up in the countryside, moved from Nottingham to the countryside, was a bit of a country bumpkin, and that was a perfect place for your imagination, dreaming. And I just thought, one day I'd like to be a singer, and I'd like to design my own clothes, a bit like Diana Ross in Mahogany. That would have been my dream. It's like, whoa, you can design your own clothes and then go and sing in them. I went to Lincoln Art School, and very luckily, all of the tutors there had come from the Royal College of Art, and they were very... they were really pushing their students to do well. I wanted to go to Manchester or Nottingham, and I got into St. Martin's. I had to put 3 choices, and I said, I don't really want to go to London. I was a bit scared of going to London. And they go, you'll bloody well go. If you've got into St. Martin's, you don't refuse a place there. And I don't think I realised quite how important it was as an art school. I suppose it's because it's in London, it gets all the attention. We had great visiting lecturers like Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren had turned up one day, and the Sex Pistols and modelling in life drawing classes. It was kind of just such a weird collection of clashing cultures. It was great. And then they were sending off to people to work for Dior and Yves Saint Laurent. It was like all kinds of stuff going on. But so I got in by sheer luck. I mean, I left school when I was 16. You were meant to go there and have 2 A-levels, and I kind of did some A-levels on my foundation course and managed to somehow scrape through. I think I was very lucky, and I had some great tutors who were really encouraging.
I mean, did you have a particular mentor when you were there?
Natalie Gibson. She's a textile designer, and she is a good friend of Sandra Rhodes, Andrew Logan, Dougie Fields, David Hockney, Celia Birtwell, and these were all people I used to read about in magazines. And then suddenly Natalie's our teacher, and she's mates with them all, and we're going around for tea with them. And
but what do you think I mean, your contemporaries at St. Martin's, so many of them became the creatives in throughout the next years, not just in fashion and pop, but, directors, even in media, even working and changing the face and things like, magazines that became incredibly important. So do you think there was something that you really grasped at that time that has been important throughout your life?
I think just to be stubborn and ignorant, probably, which I was already. But I think just stick to whatever it is that you are. And I think I was defiantly stubborn. I can remember turning up at St. Martin's and, everyone's dressed up. They're all townies. They're all punks and new romantics. Not quite new romantics. That was just about to happen. And I just thought, I can't really compete with these people. But I'd grown up on a farm and got some great farm overalls. So I turned up in a 1940s milkmaid's overall and some plaits and drew freckles on my face and some Wellingtons and accentuated the country pumpkin. So maybe it's just honesty. Don't try to be something that you are not, and people will probably appreciate your honesty. And I think that comes through in our music, really.
But I think also that what you're saying is effectively what we were saying about the bands that I was in. Use what you have. If you've come from a farm, use that. If you come from North Manchester and you're in a room and it's cold, use that. Write a song. It's like just use what you have. And I think nowadays the reason things become so homogenized is everybody's kind of got the same things now. So we all have the same experiences. But it was, I think, as an outsider looking in at that St. Martin's thing, very much the same as the factory thing. There's an energy of not that many people. There's a small group of people, all very energetically pursuing something in a very often obnoxious way, but a very convinced by themselves, and not going to be dissuaded. And there's a lot to be said for that.
Well, also, I mean, this, as you mentioned, sort of Tony Wilson, the factory era in the 80s, and in London, I think a lot of it was also, I think probably against is the wrong word, but it was definitely contrary to the politics of the time, and also within this sort of fog of the AIDS era. Do you know what I mean? It was
you can't take that out of the equation. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very true.
I think there was a determination, but I think, we had a lot of things to fight against and survive through. But I also think a lot of it was to do with class. I mean, I think a lot of people who made that headway, this thing, social mobility, became a kind of tag in hindsight. But I think there were working class kids who'd been given a grant provided by a Labour government to get into art schools, to do something and make something out of themselves. And then by the time we were flourishing, it was the 80s and the Thatcher era, so there was money to be had as well. But we'd had this determination that came from nothing. So I think the inspiration was different. I feel now, even with kids that aren't privileged, because of the access of information, everyone's sort of leveled out by the internet and, technology, as we've said. Everyone's kind of got the same access, got the same starting point, and it's not quite so diverse and different. But in another direction, it's kind of inclusive as well. So I suppose everything has its good and bad points. That got a bit confusing. Sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent.
Andy, in Manchester, there was for Corinne as well, there's the additional thing of being northern isn't being southern, particularly during, I think today in Britain,
Tony Wilson was the great champion of anti-London. In fact, we were a disgrace in his eyes, and quite a few people, that we betrayed, I betrayed Manchester going down to London and being, having a hit and whatever. That was seen as a betrayal, but in a kind of benign, almost jovial way. It was, I betrayed something, the ethos of. Because it was very much, a circle the wagons kind of thing as against that. And there's energy in that, and like you said about St. Martin's, you could really feel like Corinne would walk in the street, and various friends of hers, and I'm quite staid in my, general demeanour, but Corinne would be out with friends, and people would just be stopping and laughing, like, look, what are you doing? What are you dressed in? And I could see you, Corinne, and your friends loving the idea of that, and there was energy there. There was a real kind of something was happening, you could feel it. And it was an interesting time, very much so.
Well, you knew if people were laughing. It was the same when I used to go dressed up in a kimono when I was about 12, when I loved David Bowie, and the same thing. People would go, what the hell's that? And it's like, you knew you were doing something right because you didn't look like everyone else. But the other thing I was going to say about the North and South thing, I can remember coming to London and, posh people and Southern people go, Latham, Bath and Grass, it's Latham, but I still say Latham, Bath and Grass. And so when I hooked up with Andy, and I've been a northerner who moved to London, who then spent time in Manchester, Andy from factory moonlighting with somebody who was connected with London. And I remember saying to Tony Wilson, oh, you probably hate me because I've stolen Andy away and we've moved to London, or we've traded with London. But he also clocked that we always spent time in Manchester. Andy lived in Manchester. I moved up to Manchester. We had a studio in Manchester, and we worked with Manchester musicians. And he said, "No, you're creating a, two-way traffic. It's fine." I think he called me an honorary Mancunian, so I don't think he minded that much. Andy, he knew that we were still keeping our feet on the ground in the north.
Well, let's talk about The Living Return, which is one of the albums which came out in '94. And this one came on the heels of the live album at the Jazz Cafe. And so what was it about the experience of creating live at the Jazz Cafe that fed or influenced The Living Return? Now, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to see all the interviews, go to popthehistorymakers.com. There's a drop-down menu which helps you navigate the site. Now, let's get back to Andy and Corinne from Swing Out Sister.
I think that album came about because we're unlike a lot of people. I think we would always, bands at that time tended to recreate with technology on the gigs a lot more than we did. I came from a place where we all had to play, you just played the songs. You didn't have technology helping you. So we had to reinvent a lot of the songs that had orchestral things and big sounds and timpanis. And we had to find a way to, so the way we've developed it was we would develop the arrangements a little bit more. So things would go off at a tangent and we'd do things in different styles. And we got to a point with the live album where we thought, that's an interesting way to go about something. Why don't we try, it's not a revolutionary idea, but why don't we try writing the songs with a band? Instead of having to take the song from the studio and then teach everybody the thing and then deconstruct it and make something new happen, why don't we do the deconstruction first and see what would happen if we did, reverse engineered the process, if you like. And so it's basically the sound of a lot of us sitting in a room in an old school, very old school way, just hacking away until something came about. And I think, it could be, I think in the studio, you are sculpting, let's say, you're putting something on. You're always putting something on, and when the live thing, you're chopping stuff away. And I think that the Living Return one is much more the sound of hacking at something until what's left is the song, as opposed to us constantly adding stuff. Having said that, once we had the song, they do get quite developed. But it's still only the sound of the people in the room playing, which I think is the only time that's ever happened for us on an album. It's usually lots of trickery going on.
I mean, there's certainly a lot of experimentation in your work. I think more than I initially thought. I know that sounds
well. I'm glad to see you say that's. Yeah, no, that's a very nice. I'm very happy to hear you say that, because I think a lot of people, once you kind of move away from the limelight and the nuances of what you're doing aren't generally appreciated. So people think we'll happy-go-lucky sing a song and some nice horns. And yes, that's true. But equally, there's an awful lot of other stuff that people don't associate with us that I feel is a bit of a shame.
There's a Delphonics song on that album. The La La Means I Love You. And it was used on 4 Weddings and a Funeral, I think. It's used in one of the weddings. Did they approach you and say, we want you to make that track? Or did they approach you after the track existed and say, we want to use that track?
It was after the event, and it sounds, do I tell a flowery story or do I just tell the truth? I think it was a Polygram film. We were on Polygram Records and we had a record about to come out, so they included it. And I think it was whoever was around. I think we were replaced by the next person they had a release with. So we weren't in every single copy of that film, it's...
I mean, when you get chosen, you don't know whether it's going to be used, and you don't know how it's going to be used, do you? So
no.
Was it a case of seeing the film and then finding out how it was used?
I think with that one, we just knew the gist of the film. We didn't really know where it was going to be included because there were bits of people singing songs in the film and, title credits, music and stuff. But we have been included in other things where we get sent stuff by our publisher and they describe the scene and you kind of think, I've never actually said no, but I've said, are you sure this is okay? And one of the instances for that, it isn't a song that's included on this box set, so I'll keep it brief, was for Pose. And they wanted to use Breakout. And they said, Electra completes her transition she's got a syringe in her hand, and I didn't really take much notice of the transition bit, and I thought, oh, is this about someone taking heroin? But I thought, well, it seems like an interesting story. But then we suddenly got all this adulation from gay friends in New York. I'm thinking, what's all this about? You've got the perfect spot, and it's the pivotal moment in Pose, but it was on some kind of obscure cable channel. Then later, a couple of years later, it was on the BBC, and it's like, wow, some things, are really surprising. You kind of think it's a little independent production, and it takes the world by storm. And it was a proud moment to have Breakout included in that.
It felt for me also a little bit full circle, because how I remember Breakout was what I said before about during the AIDS era, this very upbeat, positive song during an era that was very negative. Do you know what I mean? I mean, this is from a gay man's perspective, obviously, but and so for me, it felt full circle in the extent that it fitted Pose perfectly.
Yeah, that's a nice. I hadn't thought of it like that, but that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it does close the circle. Yeah, but that was the thing in America. I hadn't noticed that. Certainly when I say America, LA and West Coast and East Coast, New York and LA, but. There was very much that, when we went over there, the audience, a lot of the audience was the gay following, because it was kind of almost an anthem, at that time. And we hadn't, because America's great for that, like you think who your audience is here, but once you get to America, you've no idea. They're playing you on urban radio because they haven't seen you yet, and once they see you, it's like, no, let's get them off there. So it's always fun in America.
I mean, it was a song that was out, I don't know if this is the right way to say it, out of its time, and I mean that in a positive way. It's one of those songs that could have been any era and still be as impactful as it was. And it sort of relates, Andy, to what you said about, being experimental, and also what you said in other interviews about being out of step.
Yeah, I'd say that a lot. No, it does, because we took that into the record company, and it was a 2-single deal, and that was the second single. So they were effectively saying, well, we'll put it out, but it won't do anything, and we're not picking up the option. So okay, that's fair enough. But it came from such a weird place. It came from, it was going to be electro pop, and then it was Paul O'Duffy who had the idea of putting the horns, getting a horn arrangement. And all of a sudden it became this thing that none of us had predicted, which I think are always the best things. It's like the thing that just arrives as an amalgam of all your various bits and something else you didn't see coming. And it becomes something that nobody's actually made. We've all contributed to, it's the Casablanca theory, isn't it? It's like you get so many writers, nobody's actually telling the story anymore. And it was like that. And you can't, it's lightning in a bottle. You can't do it if you can catch it once. And because it was so out of step, it's hard to imagine if you go back and think, what were people playing at that time? And put that in the mix. And it was such a ridiculously different sound to, Flock of Seagulls or whoever it might have been. It just caught everyone off guard. And as soon as you heard it on the radio, you just felt better. It was just one of those. I'd love to be able to do it again.
Is this something that sort of connects with the idea of being obstinate?
I suppose so, because I think the truth of it is, that's not the sound of one person being obstinate. That's everybody along the line being completely obstinate and not changing what they're doing. And so you end up with this, whatever it is. It's, I don't know.
I think also that was one of the early records that we made, of the early songs that we wrote together. And so Andy was weather reporter Joe Zawinul with a bit of Bacharach thrown in. I wanted to be Shirley Bassey or Michael Jackson with a bit of Dionne Warwick thrown in. Martin, meanwhile, he was in magazines, so there was the punk and the more rock element. He'd been in the Chameleons after that. I mean, it was such an odd mix of ingredients that we managed to make it work and pull it off. As just a miracle, really. And then the record company was scratching their head because it didn't really fit in with what was going on playlists at the time. They weren't called, radio playlists. I'm going, oh, it's a bit it's a bit too jazz for pop, and it's a bit too pop for jazz. They didn't know how to categorize us. It's like, what is this? And that was a good thing. And getting back to what you were saying, like it's a timeless. I think we from the start wanted to create something that was timeless, but also to make music and a record that made people feel the way we felt when we heard something fantastic, like wow, when you hear ABC by the Jacksons, or Teen Town by Weather Report, when you hear that record that just makes you leap up and feel happy, we wanted to do that. And it's a shame that your own record can never have the same effect on you, but hopefully you can pass it on. It's been passed on to us by people who've inspired us, and we can pass it on. And the amount of young bands we meet, and they scratch their head and go, oh, you're Swing Out Sister. We were looking for a producer, and we took, we played him a copy of Breakout because we wanted our record to sound like you. And, that's people like 10, 20 years younger than us. So
that's still quite old, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we still got a bit of mileage.
Bloody well hope so. I just want to say I'm not surprised you had a gay audience with America when Shirley Bassey meets Michael Jackson.
Yeah, so that's going to work, isn't it? That is going to work.
Absolutely brilliant. Okay, let's get on to Shapes and Patterns, which was in '97. And you mentioned Japan. This was the first sort of foray into Japan, to put it that way. And you sort of said it. Well, you didn't describe it as a lifeline, but in a way, it was a reason for you to be able to keep going, both that album and the later one. But it also was a massive success in Japan. You won a Grammy.
Yes, the equivalent of what was it? A Diamond Award? Is that what it was?
A Grand Prix Award.
Grand Prix Award.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. No, it was a lifeline, and I think. Looking through this box set, it's interesting from my point of view to see, and this is a good example, that all the way from the start of this to the end of it, we've basically been washed up by this point. It's like the first few albums we have tailed off. This is the dark ages now in terms of career, because nobody's paying attention, certainly in England, and except for enthusiasts, you've really gone to a place where you're kind of feeling around in the dark, and Japan was a shot in the arm in terms of people being interested. That you did have an audience who kind of listened to what you did and gave it credence, which we needed. Nobody, you can't work in a vacuum. As much as we'd like to pretend, it's like it doesn't matter if people are listening. Of course it does, and. Yes, it turned out a lot of people were listening there, and to the extent that Now You're Not Here, which was the big hit in Japan off that record, sold in Japan because it crossed over because it was on their TV show. They used it for the TV theme, TV drama, which are massive in Japan, and so they released it to the domestic audience, and Now You're Not Here, the single of Now You're Not Here, sold in Japan more than the single of Breakout sold in the world. So you can't, those figures don't really add up, do they?
Well, it's a beautiful album. I mean, I really think it's got,
thank you.
Got amazing tracks on it, and what kind of and it has this Bacharach, not to everything, but it has this also Bacharach influence on some tracks. And one really strange titled track was, of course, Joe Meek's Cat.
Oh, you were talking somewhere deeper. I was thinking Shapes and Patterns. Sorry, I'm talking about the wrong album.
No, that is Shapes and Patterns.
That is Shapes and Patterns.
Has that got Joe Meek's Cat on?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, it has.
Because we recorded it in Highbury corner. There was a studio there. What was it called? Swan-Yard Studios, and it was on Holloway, at the start of Holloway Road. And of course, that's where Joe Meek lived, up the top of Holloway Road. So it was a reference because we used to go past on the way where he lived, and I think there was a pub that used to have a Joe Meek appreciation night just up the road.
Yeah, but also, it's hard to justify that piece, honestly.
Well, okay, maybe hard to justify, but I think on certain levels there's a massive connection because Joe Meek was a massive experimenter in music, wasn't he? He was someone who really did things in a different way, trying to search for the right sound. And maybe, Andy, that is you.
Well, it's certainly, there's a little bit of me, but it was certainly Paul around that time, Paul O'Duffy, who produced the record. And the thing for me, that was his. We were back with him there, whereas on the previous album we'd been with Ray Hayden, And it felt like when we got back with Paul at this point, it very much was more the case, because things had moved technologically and career-wise, and his career-wise, it became we became a kind of a trinity. It had always previously been the producer and the art. We would fight our corner, he would fight his, but he had the record company in mind. And I think by this point now, it's starting to be the three of us. It's starting to be a three-way fight, if you like, or maybe fight's not always the right word, but there was an equal footing between us. So he would be involved in the writing, we would be involved in some of the techniques production-wise. And yeah, we had a lot of fun messing with things and seeing how things would go boing if we hit them with various, the stuff when you've got too much time in your hands in the studio, the stuff you can get up to. But yeah, it was fun. It was good. It was great fun making that record, actually.
Do you know why Joe Meek's cat? And what it was with Joe Meek?
About the cat?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I think we just hoped he had a cat.
Oh, no. He used to do ghost hunting expeditions. And apparently, I mean, it's allegedly, he captured recordings of a talking cat channeling the spirit of a former landowner who committed suicide at the farm.
Oh, excellent. You see, yeah. I should have known that, shouldn't I? I should have been able to regale you with that story.
That thing should have added it on later,
Yeah.
We maybe had read that somewhere, or
I'm sure we had.
Or it's the title of a book, and completely forgotten. But
sorry.
I was just going to say we worked with some interesting people on that album. Frank Campbell, who was a friend of Paul, our producer, and he did the arrangements on there, and he was an ex-father priest, and so there was a bit of an ecclesiastical feel with some of those arrangements. They were very, higher than high.
You talk about us being off the beaten track. He came in to do a vocal arrangement for us, and he said, I really like the song. It sounds a little bit like The Bachelors. So that was how contemporary he was.
Well, maybe that's how he got to Joe Meek, I think.
Well,
So then the next album was Filth and Dreams, and this was one that was only released in Japan, and this now is its first release, as I understand, elsewhere. And again, I mean, When Morning Comes, absolutely outstanding track. I love Sugar Free because it feels to me as well that, Andy, you went a bit trippy.
This real story there is Corinne went a bit trippy on that album for various reasons. But no, I think
do tell.
No, I'll let Corinne tell. No, it came out a lot darker than we intended, that one. I'm not entirely sure why, and I liked that it did. I like kind of the mood of the overall mood, but it's. The thing you see after the event, you think, oh, I see now. There's a darkness in that, which we didn't at the time. We weren't aware of. But again, I think that's even more so. You can feel it's almost hermetically sealed. It's like the three of us not getting out enough, basically, because we were just going in there every day. Paul and Corinne and I just sitting in this room, and it's the sound. It's very, for me, it has a kind of claustrophobic sound to it, which I don't dislike. But it's uncomfortable. In fact, we got to the end of that album, and it always takes us a year. But I think we really hadn't seen much of anybody for a year, and we decided we would go and have a meal to celebrate. Be amongst people. So we went to a restaurant in Notting Hill, and we thought, this is great. We felt a bit awkward, so many people around, and sat down at the table, and we were thinking, right, let's just have a chat about the world. And so we sat there with a glass of wine, and eventually Paul said, those speakers are out of phase, aren't they? All we could talk about were the speakers in the restaurant and how badly they were EQ'd, and it was just we had nothing to talk about in the world. So
Corinne, trippy? Come on, I need to know.
Is this off the record or on the record? I think there were a few combustibles around, not necessarily being consumed by me, but it was in the air. And also, the only place I could sit in the studio while we were recording was on top of a bass speaker. So combustible consumption inhalation. I didn't inhale. And, this really heavy, low frequency, I think it brought out a certain darkness, and there was a lot of soul searching, a lot of wandering around, but also just a playfulness, I think, that came out. I think, there was sort of hip-hoppy, trip-hoppy stuff around, and so it was quite an odd mix of just discovering some other things. Although I think when we started out, we kept it small. There wasn't much of a budget. There were just Andy, Paul and myself and Tim on guitar. Andy and Paul did most of the vocals, backing vocals with Tim. And, we wanted it to have a sort of dusty, earthy sound, a bit Brazilian. We thought with our smaller, compact group of personnel, we'll make it have a more Brazilian feel. But it's Brazilian with a bit of hip hop, with a bit of psychedelic something or other thrown in. And so it made for quite an interesting combination. But I'm glad you like this album, because I think we did explore some different places there.
I think lyrically, it's my favourite. I think you, like you said, whether you were, chemically induced or not, I do think there was.
I need to visit that place more often.
I think so. I think it goes places lyrically that you don't generally.
Yeah, it's a bit more let go, a bit more out there.
Do you think something like this album would have? Okay, when you're young, when we're young, and record companies deal with artists who are young differently, particularly at the era then, they're dealing with, you have to be young or you have to stay at the top to be able to continue. And for you, because that wasn't really the case in terms of the profile, but in terms of the quality, I think the quality was greater later in your career than it was at the beginning. And,
I think absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
And
absolutely
so it's odd.
agree.
So how did you feel about how the record companies dealt with you and being sort of, I don't know about dismissed, but not being part of their group, as it were?
I think we're both quite pragmatic, and I think we, if there's something to our credit, I think we dealt with success and the lack of success with equal, equanimity. What's that? If you can take the Ancient Mariner? No, it's not. It's if, isn't it? If you can take the da-das with the da-da, you can do that. And I think that was the case. We didn't take the success seriously, and we were somehow. It does affect you, because if you're proud of what you do, you want to share it with the world, and all of a sudden that avenue is not open to you. So you think, well, there's a certain. But the thing that I think is interesting on listening, but certainly when we listen back in our marathon session, was as it gets further away, the idea that something will be heard, we almost, I wouldn't say celebrate it, but there's something healthy comes from it. The idea that this won't mean a great deal to many people somehow will conversely make it even better than it needs to be, for some perverse reason. And I think that goes back to Manchester and stubbornness and Corinne and Lincoln. It's the idea that, first of all, don't be dissuaded from making it as good as it can be. And I'd like to think that the sound of this, and I'm glad that you've said that, because I do think it has got better, and I'm very proud of that. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, let's get on to the next album, because Somewhere Deep in the Night. Now, because Paul Staveley O'Duffy had worked with John Barry, and you mentioned film music, and of course John Barry, James Bond, and this, for me, like Through the Sky and Touch Me Now, have this sort of orchestral, James Bondish type feel to them. And, when you mentioned earlier that your music is often filmic, this certainly is, isn't it?
Oh yes, it's the absolute us completely going for it on that front. And I think I think Paul is the only producer I can think of who we could have done that with. First of all, who would spend the time. Like I say, again, it was a year of his time and ours, and not with much of a budget. And to find a producer who you're in lockstep with, in terms of he can hear what we can hear, And that's it's so unusual, to find somebody who's prepared to go down that road with you. And it wouldn't have been, and a lot of the ideas were his, certainly he encouraged things, and he was open to also. But I think John Barry is the unspoken thing, and you were saying earlier about our influences, and even with Martin at the time, it's about finding common ground, isn't it? When you're forming a band, it's like, what do we coalesce around? What do we have that we don't fight about? And the one thing we had, Corinne from Shirley Bassey, me from his soundtracks, and Paul from his background, it was John Barry. And he was the glue of everything. Certainly you can hear it all over that first record. And even Martin, to an extent, he had the same thing. So we were all happy. If we were going in a vaguely John Barry direction, the world was at peace, and it's always been like that, It's probably osmosis. It's gone a little bit more into Morricone as the later years have progressed, but certainly John Barry's never far away. And I think that album, Somewhere Deep in the Night, it's us doing the full-on homage, if you like.
Corinne, you've talked about that album being conceived on a mountain.
Yeah, well, we were late beginners, but Andy and I got into skiing, and it turned out Paul was an excellent skier, so we all went on a holiday together, and it was the sheer exhilaration of skiing down mountains. And Andy happened to notice it's kind of like the rhythm of skiing is like the rhythm of music. And we were with an instructor who said, do you want to ski down the mountain at midnight? And we're going, well, how can we do that? All the lifts are closed. And he's going, well, I grew up on this mountain. I know all the routes. And so we skied down a mountain under the moon with the clouds beneath us. It was so awe-inspiring, and it was just like we were in another world, but it was cinematic, it was orchestral, it was like we're on the highest mountaintop about to ski down to the valley, and it was like, this is just insane. And I think that's stuck in our mind. So while we were working on Somewhere Deep in the Night, this was the vision that was in our minds while we were creating the music. And it was a much more an instrumental album than it had been before. And Andy and Paul going, oh, when are you going to get some lyrics written? But I think some of those pieces were much more instrumental than songs. I didn't want to spoil them. I felt like a lesser being part of that music. So then Andy and Paul did some singing, and it was just this monumental wall of sound that came from just the three of us again, really. Well, Tim, actually guitarist, he did some of the singing too, didn't he?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a big expanse, isn't it? A James Bond, skiing on a mountain is James Bond straight away, but it's also the big expanse, the vistas, the scenery, the incredible enormity of it all, which does sort of transfer to the music, and that is, I think, quite beautiful.
It's I know one should never say it, but if I had to pick one album, that's the album for me. That's the one that everything comes together. The one that you think, in hindsight, you think, well, how did that happen? There's certain ones. It just seems like it's always been there. You couldn't have actually. Most of the things I can see how they're constructed. I know we did that, and I remember playing the bass. That one, it seems removed somehow. It's like I don't know where that arrived from. But,
I think it was probably something that we were aspiring to from the very beginning, but we didn't really know at the beginning. It's something we were heading towards, and we had all the inspiration, but that our abilities didn't allow us to at the very beginning. And funnily enough, Paul was brought in as a producer to kind of get us as a little three-piece indie band from Manchester to sound a little bit more commercial and palatable for radio. So he was very much on the side of the record company when he first joined us. But by the time we got to this album, he was very much over to our side. And
it turned him double agent.
All about the experimentation. You hear about the Beatles and the Beach Boys, and they spent more time in the studio than anything, experimenting, doing all kinds of other things. But, you can hear the experimentation in Pet Sounds and Sgt. Pepper's, how they arrived at that, goodness knows how, but they were just having fun. And I think we were full on down that route by the time we got to Somewhere Deep in the Night. That's why we were in the studio. I think it was longer than a year, but we were just in there every day. We'd stay in there all night. We'd always go for breakfast in a cafe around the corner going, where did the day and night go?
I mean, the final album, Where Our Love Grows, and the only reference I want to make here is in terms of that title, and how you have been able to deal together with disagreements, with things that, even things in the studios, how you've managed to remain, with this amazing partnership over all these years. I mean, I can't keep a boyfriend for 6 months.
Well, the daft thing about that album is about that title, rather. The title came from some group, an online group, fan group, and somebody started a rumor that was we were sitting somewhere on holiday, I think, and oh, look at this, there's a rumor, there's a new album about to come out. Now we weren't even in the studio at this point. There's a new album coming out called Where Our Love Grows. And we were like, really? That's news. so we wrote it down and thought, okay, so when the time came to title the album, we thought, let somebody have a scoop. So yeah, it was. I don't even know who it was who wrote that, but yeah, it does feel like that. I said somewhere, you say these very soundbitey things, but the Melancholy I was talking about was the previous Somewhere Deep in the Night. That's the melancholic one for me, and this one is exuberance somehow. It's joy, and I didn't see it coming because it didn't feel like a particularly joyful time. But everything I hear on that makes me just, it gives me a good feeling, and I think this one actually is weird. And there's a few tracks, there's a couple of bonus tracks on here and on the previous album, where I think what we'd started to do was make the thing and then remove most of it. There's a couple of, I think there was something, one of them is Love Won't Let You Down, More Love. There's two songs at the end, and they're basically the song with all of the rhythm taken out, so that it always feels to me like, they made domes of cathedrals. You make the thing and then you put the stone over it, and then you take the whatever it is that the structure from underneath you take out, so the dome is left, and you think, well, how the hell did they make that? And there's a couple on there just like that, where you would never have made the structure that appears without having had the substructure that you've removed. It is all very technical, but they like hover in space, these things, and you think you never could have done that without the stuff that's absent. Sorry, I'm not explaining it very well.
And also, you avoided the question very well. So,
oh yes,
congratulate you on that. Maybe Corinne can answer that then.
We don't know the answer.
I mean, we could just make something up. I think not being offended when we want to spend time apart is quite a good one. So Andy disappears off to his place, I'll stay in my place. Even when we're in the same house or in separate rooms, just knowing that we're there is enough. You don't always have to be together, and we both do completely different things in our spare time. I think you just have to allow yourself some space. Most people have separate jobs and then they come together in their social life, and I mean, we have our mutual place for creating things, but we spend a lot of time apart. Sometimes people think, is everything all right between you two? Yep, it's fine.
Yeah, that's the key. That's definitely the key.
Well, I'll take that on board. Anyhow, Corinne and Andy from Swing Out Sister, I want to thank you, but I want to end by also thanking you for your contribution to popular culture, because I think often people don't say it, and they don't really necessarily get the chance to say it. And for me, because I'm able to do an interview, and you've really provided something different over the years, a uniqueness that cuts against the grain. So for that, I really want to thank you.
Well, that means a lot. Thank you very much. And thank you for yours, for all the years you've been doing this. you know, it's we all do our little bit, don't we? Somehow.
Exactly. And if you find that photo from Ibiza,
I have
burn it.
no. We all look quite cool.
Right.
You know, so I will find it and send it. Anyway.
And thank you for a great, insightful interview. Because if we have a great interview, it'll make us think of things we never thought of before. So you've got a great skill in extracting information.
Brilliant.
We can go
Thanks
and have
very
an
much for the
argument
compliment.
now.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Bye, guys. Thanks a lot.
Cheers,
Bye.
Steve.
Thank you.